and welcome to episode 27 of the Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic Cape history and a global medieval past. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. We are sponsored by Turath Publishing. Listeners get a 50% discount on all purchases. Visit Turath Publishing at turath.co.uk and use discount code POD15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact Turath Publishing for details. I'm your host, Talha. I'm a PhD student in the School of Oriental African Studies in London. Now on to the show. In February 2015, the former Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, released a video showing the destruction of Mesopotamian antiquities at the Museum of Mosul. Although perhaps ironic that images are used to show the destruction of images, a video intended to shock can be turned against its makers when analysed thoughtfully. Our guest this episode, Dr. Aaron Tugendorf, argues in his latest book, The Idols of ISIS From Assyria to the Internet, that iconoclasm at heart is a political manifesto, a matter understood by Abbasid philosopher Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who died in 951 Common Era. Dr. Tugendorf received his PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University in 2012 and also holds degrees in art history and social thought from the University of Chicago. In 2015, he received the Jonas Greenfield Prize for Young Semitists from the American Oriental Society. He currently teaches at Bard College, Berlin. Welcome, Dr. Tugendorf.
Thanks for having me.
Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who was born around 870 and lived until 950 Common Era, thought deeply about the relation between images and politics. He adapted the insights of ancient political philosophers, especially Plato and Aristotle, to make sense of prophetic religion. How do his political treatises shed light on Abraham's iconoclasm that ISIS claimed to uphold?
So, ISIS, as you mentioned, claimed to uphold this type of iconoclasm that they were following from the model of Muhammad and also of Ibrahim. In the video that is the focus of the book, I focus on the fact that they show a clip from one line from the story of Ibrahim smashing the idols from the Quran. And in that story, Ibrahim seems to want to establish what I call a regime without images. It's a very political story, and it's a story that the idea that the one true God should be served without any type of image mediation, and therefore we should have a polity without images. And it's in this context that I turned to the thought of Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who I think really, as you say, thinks incredibly deeply about this problem. And his main point as relevant to this issue is that politics cannot exist without images, or a political community cannot exist without images. If we think about a political community as a community that unites individuals with their individual disparate wants and desires and sort of turns those towards some type of general common understanding of the good and an agreement to follow a law that is aimed at that good, well, to get people to do that, the law itself is not sufficient, because the law by its very nature sort of imposes on individual freedom. Rather, what one needs is some type of shared imagination of the good that everybody can partake in. And that's what images achieve in Farabi's sense. And it's the role of the prophet lawgiver who has this imaginative capacity to provide images for them. And so what you end up getting is, in what I tried to articulate, right, a sort of disagreement perhaps between Ibrahim as presented in the Quran, who seems to think that you can have a regime without images, and then that followed presumably by ISIS, at least on a superficial level, and Farabi's much deeper understanding that actually that's not possible, and that to attempt that is actually problematic. Now, I should add, though, as you mentioned, the video of the iconoclasm, right, is itself an image. And so too is the story of Ibrahim smashing the idols that we have in the Quran, whether that's an image produced through language, and then there are also visual depictions of that moment. And so um, what we really have here is an image that produces a shared communal imagination of the idea that we can be living in a regime without images that's being produced. But of course, that idea, that common idea, that foundation for the political community to share that idea is dependent on that image of non images, right? And that's only one possible way of organizing a community. One can organize communities around other images, but you're never going to be able to have a political community without some type of foundational image. And that's the insight I tried to take from Al-Farabi. And I think that it's incredibly relevant up until our contemporary times.
Where ISIS spoke of the need to cleanse the world of idols, their critics refer to a moral and legal imperative to protect cultural heritage. How do we see Al-Farabi's thesis play out in our contemporary context?
So I found it really interesting, right? That on the one hand, ISIS was saying these are idols that had to be destroyed, and then on the other hand, you had these international organizations talking about the destruction of heritage, and right. So what's at stake in this change of terminology, idol versus heritage, both terms are being applied to the same objects, which suggests, right, that the object itself doesn't have a necessary understanding, but rather different types of meanings can be associated. And so the question is, what's at stake in calling it cultural heritage, and in particular, human cultural heritage? There's a sort of a bit of ambiguity in the way that things were discussed in 2015. Some people were talking about the destruction of Iraqi heritage, and some people were talking about the destruction of human heritage, and some people were talking about both at different times or interchangeably. But if we focus for a second on the idea of a human heritage, of a shared human heritage, well, I think that this connects to a certain kind of politics, it actually is a kind of image for sustaining a kind of politics where we can imagine ourselves united as a common humanity, and some type of a cosmopolitan vision, or even one might say, universal or world state vision that is sort of underlying those statements that were being put forward by these international organizations. And I think Farabi actually has a lot to say on this topic. And here, I guess I'll just point to something that I discuss in a brief footnote in the book, which is in Farabi's work, Principles of the Opinions of the Inhabitants of the Virtuous City. He talks about the different opinions of different groups, and he talks about how one group holds the opinion that shared humanity should be the foundation upon which we organize our political grouping, right? Not shared language, not shared ethnicity, not shared love of bowling, but rather shared humanity is the natural thing that we all share, and therefore should be the basis as well for our political identity. And, somewhat, I think he's having a good time here, I think, somewhat comically, ironically. He says that, right, there is this group out there that says that shared humanity should be the foundation of our political grouping. And they are saying that we need to form an army in order to suppress all of the human beings who refuse to accept this natural foundation for politics, right? And so we should go and either suppress or perhaps kill all of the human beings that refuse this quote unquote natural foundation for politics. And then he says that this opinion belongs among those who are ignorant, right, of the truth. And I would want to connect this, right, to our own attempts to try to create images of a shared humanity. At least that's the extreme case, right? The extreme case would be that we want to imagine this in such a way that anyone who would be opposed to it, right, should be suppressed. So I think that Farabi's comments there have some relevance to contemporary debates and in this regard.
You also mention in your book how once archaeologists commonly remove so-called late levels, that is medieval and modern Islamic remains, without recording them to get to the ancient layers underneath, allied in the Islamic Middle East, as though only the so-called West beholds antiquity's beauty today. What is called the secular can also have their idols, correct?
Absolutely. So again, turning to Al-Farabi, the one of the key works that I'm using is his book of religion, where he defines religion as establishing those set of beliefs that are necessary for holding a political community together. And so, in that incredibly political definition of religion, right, from this Al-Farabian sense, all political communities have religion. There's simply no such thing as a quote unquote secular political community, or rather, to just a political community without religion. So that's one thing that I think Farabi is helpful with, to the extent that all political communities depend on these images, therefore they're all going to have a religion. Now, this raises this question about the term idol, and maybe I can say a couple of words about that to help some clarification. So in the Quranic passage itself, right, as translated into English, the terms image and idol in the passage about Ibrahim are used interchangeably. So they go back and forth, and there seems to be no real distinction between the two of them made. And I think that that's really significant, because in that story, Ibrahim is presented as opposed to images as such, as of these humanly made objects that are going to be intermediaries between human beings and the proper object of their service. And so to Ibrahim, all images are idols. If by idol we mean an image that is deemed to be inappropriate for the purpose for certain types of political purposes. And so to someone like Ibrahim, those two terms are interchangeable, because all images are idols. Now, we might be more selective, but that doesn't mean that whatever this we is, right? Any political community, right, is going to have certain types of images that they want to deem to be inappropriate for orienting the political community. And therefore, they might designate those as idols in order to mark them somehow as inappropriate. That's something, for example, going on in Great Britain and the United States right now, with statues of people connected to slaveholding or to Confederate soldiers and these types of things, right? These were images at one point deemed appropriate for orienting a political community, and now, at least among certain part of the population, they're being deemed inappropriate. And so therefore, in that sense, the same image shifts in its designation from licit to illicit. And so, in that sense, all political communities are going to have to be navigating this issue, because they're all going to be using images necessarily for orienting themselves politically.
Your book ends creatively employing Al-Farabi's thoughts on images and politics in the age of video games. How would the philosopher have advised Trump?
Huh. Well, thankfully, Trump perhaps doesn't need any more advisors right now, so at least I'm happy with that. But that's a great question. I'm not sure how he would have advised Trump. I would have to think about this more. I think he certainly would have advice for us today in helping us more generally try to deal with the realities of how images work politically, and how things have changed in certain respects as a result of digital culture. So I think that they haven't changed entirely. I think that in many ways, the insights that Al-Farabi has about the relationship between images and politics is entirely relevant to us today. And in that sense, I would love to see Al-Farabi added to the canon of theorists that one studies in communications courses, right? So one should certainly be reading Al-Farabi alongside Deleuze and others. And if this book and this podcast can help that happen, that would make me very, very happy. Now, that said, I think that the reality that we're facing today with algorithmically controlled interactive digital platforms as the primary, though not exclusive, but the primary means of distributing and disseminating images, does add certain complications that require thinking with Farabi, but not, I think Farabi can help us think through these problems, but they're not going to be, then they create more complexities than Farabi's situation would have known. And so let me see if I can explain that a little bit more. So Farabi, and this is really an idealization that he presents, right? He has this idealization of the prophet or the prophet lawgiver and the role that the prophet or the prophet lawgiver plays, right? So as lawgiver, the lawgiver is meant to establish certain rules that everybody is going to have to follow, and therefore they're going to have to limit their own freedom. Each is going to have to limit their own freedom in different ways in order for the community to function successfully and aim at some type of common good. And according to Farabi, if that doesn't happen, if human beings don't form communities in which they can live together and strive together towards a common good, then happiness is impossible. He really believes that human beings are fundamentally political, in like following Aristotle, in the idea that that our happiness depends on our living productively together. We can't just go it alone. So that's what the law does. But the law on its own, as I was saying, right, because it necessarily limits each person's freedom, it needs somehow to be, each person needs to be inspired to follow it. And that's what Farabi says is the role that images do, because I suppose here the idea is that just some type of pure rational understanding of the good of the law is not possible, or it's at least not possible for the vast swaths of a population. Maybe a couple of Kants out there can do that, but for most people, that's not really available, and therefore they need to be given some type of more grounded reason for following the law through their imagination. And the prophet is able to devise the right images because the prophet knows the population incredibly well, right? This is, again, one of these sort of assumptions that Farabi is making, that the prophet knows the particular population so perfectly that he's able to design the appropriate images. And he knows that different communities are going to need different images because different communities come with their own histories, they come with their own geographies, et cetera, right? And that the same images are not going to work for every single community. And it's the role of the prophet to sort of be so wise as to get that. Why do I say all of this in relationship to contemporary social media, for example? Well, one might want to think of something like Facebook or other forms of social media and as, quote unquote, the perfect prophet. Mark Zuckerberg at times has talked about Facebook, right, as this thing that is going to get to know each of our individual desires so perfectly that it's going to know what we want, and therefore it's going to provide us with what we want, right? And so the images that are sent back to us are precisely the images that we want, that are determined by the algorithms based on our interaction with the platforms, right? Through clicking and liking and sharing and whatnot, right? And so we might think, therefore, of the platform as the perfect prophet, right? Able to know exactly what each person wants and providing those. Already, I think we should be worried about this, because if the prophet in Farabi's sense, right, was precisely supposed to be producing images that, yes, were necessarily suited to a particular community, but to a community, not to individuals. Because if it were just individuals, then it would undermine the possibility of the whole goal of bringing people together into a community, right? It's not supposed to be so solipsistic as to be just different images for each individual. And in this regard, I'm always reminded of a wonderful headline in the satirical newspaper, The Onion, where the headline is, "Everyone in Middle East given own country in 317 million state solution," right? And we can think, right, well, this is a solution. If the political problem is the problem of how do you get people to live together in a state, right? Well, one way to solve that is, well, give each of them their own state, and at least most of them will be able to live with themselves. I mean, I don't know. There might be people who are so self-hating that even that won't be a proper solution to the political problem. But and we could imagine extending this Middle East solution to the world at large. And I think that, in a sense, Zuckerberg is trying to do that. But so anyway, I'm trying to lay out, right? So is Facebook the perfect prophet, or is it precisely undermining what the Farabian prophet wants to do, right? It knows, it's as wise or wiser than the Farabian prophet, but it seems to be directing us towards ourselves rather than towards some type of shared community, or as one might say, and this, a lot of people have been talking about how social media polarizes us into different groups, right? Well, then we can also say that maybe it's polarizing. It does produce groups, but in a way that is detrimental to political life within an actual state. So I think that Farabi has a lot to say, right? So in this regard, right? We're no longer living in the situation of Farabi's perfect prophet, where the prophet, which all unidirectional, right? The prophet comes up with the images and all the people are consuming them, right? We think now, well, no, we're democracy. We're all involved in making our own images, right? But to the extent that they're processed through the algorithms of the platforms, I think that itself gets complicated, and it's not as ideal. It's as at least in the early moments of social media, we were all thinking that this was going to be some type of ideal democratizing force, and I think that we're all wizened up to that by now. And so I don't know if I may, for one more second on this, I'd just say that if iconoclasm is, as I was saying before, the attempt to eradicate the images that we consider to be inappropriate for orienting our political community, and trying to eradicate them and get rid of them and calling them idols and destroying them, right? Well, one last thing to keep in mind about social media is that to the extent that the algorithms respond to our interaction, right? So that each time we click, they get better at showing us only what we want to see, and in a way purifying our visual worlds from any images that might not fit the world as we want to experience it. Well, here we're getting a kind of new form of iconoclasm, an algorithmic iconoclasm. It's an iconoclasm that doesn't require hammers. It's an iconoclasm that we engage in ourselves each time that we interact with our social media platforms. And I think that this is an iconoclasm that we have not yet properly come to terms with, and that we need to think more about.
Your book, The Idols of ISIS From Assyria to the Internet, is published by University of Chicago Press. What are other current projects that listeners can anticipate?
Well, so I've been doing a lot of teaching recently, so I don't have that much in the works. But I do have at least a couple of ideas for some essays that I'd like to write. It's not sure what will happen in terms of books quite yet. One is tentatively titled, Why You Need Not Worry That You Don't Speak Phrygian. I know that this is a worry that most people have, that they don't naturally speak this ancient Anatolian language. And this is an essay that will be about a story close to my heart, that one can find in Book 2 of Herodotus' History, which is a story about the relationship between language and politics. And so I'm working on that. And then I'm also working on an essay, a project called John Maynard Keynes as a Assyriologist, which deals with the great economist, his period of so-called Babylonian madness in the 1920s, when he just became obsessed with studying ancient Mesopotamia and trying to understand the roots of money. And so that's another project that I'm working on at the moment.
Dr. Chudenduff, thank you for being a guest on the Abbasid History Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me and for trying to help make Al-Farabi part of our everyday theoretical discourse. Thanks so much.